Diamond suit like a rubber toy, or a bloated, disgusting leech, Shaltir gnawed at the Sellsword's throat. It was not clear if the Sellsword first felt dozens of needles pierce his throat, or if he heard the gross sound of his blood being drained away in an instant. The man felt his very existence being siphoned away, and the chilling dread of that realization instilled a terror in him which he had never felt before. However, even as he tried to struggle, his limbs grew heavy, and his eyesight darkened. After draining him dry, Shaltir tossed aside the desiccated corpse, licking off a stray drop of blood with a moist, gleaming tongue. Then she smiled brightly at the other Sellswords, who did not know if they should flee. Susamani more snaaks for me. Countless screams of anger and cries of despair echoed through the great hall. Diamond suit, Shaltir grinned evilly as she stood within the silent hall, which was now devoid of any movement. The orb of blood above her head had absorbed a lot of fresh gore, to the point where it was only a little smaller than her head. Thayat Wayas Furuuan. After hearing Shaltir's exclamation of delight, the vampire bride, who had been stationed at the hall's entrance to prevent anyone from escaping, lowered her head and added, "I am glad that you enjoyed yourself, my noble master." Time for the Maayadian Diayish. Shaltir wrenched open the door to the storeroom into which Brain had fled, bursting the lock off. The hinges still hung from the door in Shaltir's hand. The storeroom was cramped, with several bags and boxes within. It was here that Shaltir smelled something surprising: fresh air, scented with dust, the aroma of the wind from outdoors. At the same time, the spoor of a human grew fainter. Shaltir might have lost herself in her blood frenzy, but she still remembered the mission assigned to her. Kuah! With a furious roar, Shaltir shoved away the obstacles in her path, and advanced to the place from which the wind blew. She found a hole behind the boxes, which had been blocked up by sandstone less than a meter ahead. The fresh air flowed in from a gap in the rock. An Eskawayawap Tunny Yiltel. The lesser vampire had not been lying. He did not know there was an escape passage here. A problem one often ran into with the use of magical charms was that one could only learn what the subject already knew. The target could not give answers which they did not have, and if they believed a falsehood to be the truth, then the questioner would only learn the falsehood. Unlike Mare, Shaltir did not have any magic to move the earth. If she tried to clear it with a shockwave, it might drop the entire ceiling on them. He had escaped. Those words floated to the fore within her blood-soaked thoughts. To some extent, Shaltir understood that she had failed in her part of the mission. Shaltir snarled in anger. Why was this pitiful insect of a human being not moving in accordance to the wishes of Shaltir, a guardian of Nazarick? All I want is to turn your unnecessary lives into a feeble contribution to the glory of Nazarick. Why don't you understand and rejoice in that fact? Shaltir ground her teeth, and then the vampire bride, who had been assigned to lookout duty, called out from behind her. Shaltir-sama. The fact that one of her vampire brides had left her post incensed Shaltir, and her vision turned red as she briefly entertained the idea of killing her. In the end, she managed to bank the flames of her wrath with great effort. If she had left her position for an important matter, then she should be spared. What is it? Several people are headed this way. Leftover survivors? Theeneen, let's go out and meet Thiem. Ah-ha-ha-ha, ha-ha-ha, ha-ha-ha-ha-ha. Part 4. Shaltir leapt up and, like a little bird flitting through the night, she hopped over the log barricade at the cave entrance. The vampire brides which accompanied her slowly advanced forward. Shaltir looked on her targets with a smile. They were a disciplined, well-trained party. The frontliners comprised 3 male warriors, each equipped with different gear, but all of them had on a hauberk of scale armor, with a weapon in hand and a large shield on their backs. Behind them was a red-haired female warrior in banded armor. There was a lightly dressed man holding a staff in the rear. He was probably an arcane magic caster. Beside him was a divine magic caster, who wore a cleric's robe over his armor, and had a holy symbol shaped like a flame around his neck. There were 6 of them in total, and although they were surprised at the sight of Shaltir as she emerged from the cave, they calmly went on alert, a movement born of accumulated experience. That's good, although it was not bad to slaughter weak humans, who had the consistency of tofu. More resilient opponents like this were more interesting. With a look of anticipation in her crimson eyes, Shaltir directed a predatory grin at the people before them. Speak. Shock appeared on the face of the arcane magic caster, but only for a moment, and then his expression hardened. Enemy, probable vampire. Only silver or magic weapons effective. Unbeatable opponent. Fighting withdrawal. Don't look at her eyes. A cry rang forth, easily audible by anyone in this depression. The shouted commands had been pared down to the bare minimum, and everyone swiftly reacted to them. The warrior at the lead unlimbered his large shield and took a defensive stance. He averted his eyes, looking instead at Shaltir's chest and belly. During this time, the female warrior behind them had taken up the weapon passed to her by the warrior in front, and began applying something to it. An unpleasant odor wafted into Shaltir's nose. It was alchemical silver. This was a sticky salve made by alchemists. The magical substance spread across the weapon when applied, coating it in a thin membrane, and making it function as though it were made of silver. Weapons made of silver were not only more expensive than regular weapons, but they were softer than steel, and not suitable for long-term use. Therefore, many adventurers purchased salves like this and applied them to their weapons when the need arose, allowing them to temporarily take on the properties of silver. Wielding weapons which now radiated a silver gleam, the group moved to corral their foe as they fell back. Their fighting withdrawal was an impressive display. The party seemed to be like a single organism as they fell back in an orderly manner. My lord, O god of fire, enough with the useless stuff, hurry up and cast a defensive spell. The arcane magic caster restrained the cleric, who was planning to raise his holy symbol, and then began casting a spell on the frontliners. The cleric followed suit. Although the exact composition varied between jobs, most clerics could use divine power to turn, rebuke or destroy creatures such as undead, demons, angels, and the like. However, these abilities only worked on monsters weaker than themselves. In other words, the arcane magic caster had seen the cleric preparing to turn undead with divine might, instantly divined the difference in strength between their foes and themselves, and then instructed him to do something else with his power. As she watched this series of actions, Shaltir eyed the leader of the party, intending to capture him in accordance with her orders. However, the murderous impulse to spill more blood slowly dyed her heart a crimson red. She wanted to slaughter them, pulverize them, dismember them, and bathe in their blood. Her breathing grew ragged, and she began foaming at the mouth. Anti-evil protection. Lesser mind protection. The two magic casters laid their spells upon the frontline warriors. A vague hint of respect bloomed in Shaltir's overexcited mind. Although these spells were of the lowest tier, the first tier, in fact, they were still the most suitable magic for the current situation. They were unlike the Sellswords who had lashed out thoughtlessly, or that stupid warrior who had come out by himself without even knowing martial arts. Still, no matter how hard they struggled, meaningless actions were still meaningless. Against a foe who was so overwhelmingly superior to them, nothing they did could possibly mean anything. Their adorable show of resistance was the last straw that broke the back of Shaltir's wavering self-control. I can't take it, I can't hold back any more. With a cry like she had torn free of her bindings, Shaltir stepped forward. Her steps were light and easy, like a dancer's. However, to the people before her, she moved faster than the wind. She thrust out a spear hand. It pierced her victim's shield, shattered his armor, ignored his magical protections, ripped straight through his skin, muscle, and bone, and closed around the heart which had been beating just a moment ago. And then she tore it out. As she stood over the body of the collapsed warrior, Shaltir held up the reddish-black mass of tissue, deformed in her grip, before the others. The female warrior whimpered in fear, while the priest's face twisted in anger. Shaltir had expected these reactions. Satisfaction filled her as she watched them, and with a revolting smile, she cast a spell. Animate dead. The warrior who had lost his heart slowly stood back up, now transformed into a zombie, the lowest tier of undead. Yet, she was not finished. Shaltir gulped down the heart she was holding, and then reached into the orb of blood floating above her. What she brought back down was a pulsing lump of gore, a caricature of a heart. She then tossed the lump into the zombie. The blood lump writhed like a maggot, then distorted itself as it flowed into the zombie's body. In an instant, the zombie shuddered, its body spasming several times before its exterior slowly changed. It seemed as though all the water had evaporated from its body, given how its skin had turned into something which resembled dried bark. It sprouted sharp claws and its canines jutted out. Before long, the undead creature before them could no longer be considered a zombie. As they watched the birth of a lesser vampire, the adventurers exclaimed in shock. Impossible. I've never heard of a vampire which could use such high-tier magic without cost. You're looking at one right now, so don't panic. Calm down and think. But, retreat's going to be hard. Attack. Oh. The cleric panicked. Perhaps the others had been influenced by that, but one of the warriors swung at Shaltir. The other attacked his former comrade, who was now a lesser vampire. My lord, O god of fire, repel the unclean. The cleric held up his holy symbol, which emitted a burst of divine power. Of course, it had no effect on Shaltir. Ahahahahaha. The sword of one of the warriors bit into the body of the lesser vampire, which had been immobilized, possibly by the cleric's divine power. This was a half-baked lesser vampire which had been made from a zombie, which was why the divine power was actually effective, but the knowledge that the zombie she had made had lost to divine power displeased Shaltir. She flicked her little finger, parrying the sword pointed at her, and then glared annoyedly at the cleric who stood in the back line. Geet Lusist. She casually swiped her right hand, but this careless blow was enough to behead the sword-wielding warrior, sending him to the ground in a spray of blood. Lesser strength. That buff spell was cast on the final warrior, who was now fighting a slowed-down lesser vampire with his own enhanced body. The warrior had the upper hand and pressed his advantage. Since they seemed to be having fun, Shaltir decided to leave them be. After all, there was still prey remaining. Her mind clouded with bloodlust, Shaltir turned to the cleric before her. The female warrior stepped forward, putting herself into the line of fire, though she only wielded an ordinary steel weapon. How adorable, she's still taking a stance with a sword despite her fear, though that was ultimately the pitiful resistance of a small animal. A wave of heat and delight grew in Shaltir's lower abdomen. What sounds would she make when she chewed off her fingertips? Maybe she could cut off her ears and feed them to her. No, she should drink her blood first. After all, she was the first female prey she had encountered since she had come to the outside. You'll be my desi-ear, Shaltir bellowed from her gaping maw as she leapt over the woman. Easily leaping over the female warrior, Shaltir landed before the arcane magic caster and the cleric. Before the cleric could react, Shaltir already had the hand holding his holy symbol in her grasp, and she squeezed. The cleric's bones disintegrated under that irresistible force, and shreds of muscle and skin squirted from the gaps between Shaltir's fingers. Gwarg. After hearing the cleric's cries, Shaltir was quite pleased with herself, and decided to grant him mercy and end his torment. With a wave of her hand, the blood spurting from the stump of the cleric's neck flowed into the orb of blood above Shaltir's head. She nodded in delight. At this point, somebody thrust a sword into Shaltir's back with all their strength. However, attacks like that were completely ineffective against her. Shaltir stood firm like a great tree, though she found the sword point protruding from her chest a minor inconvenience. No way, it's not working. Isn't this a silver weapon? The sword had pierced her chest, and her heart, as it turned out, but Shaltir's nonchalance drew a garbled scream from the female warrior. Since the female warrior did not have a silver weapon, she must have taken it from the body of the slain warrior. The arcane magic caster was correct, but he was not entirely right. In order to harm Shaltir, one needed a weapon made of silver, and possessing sufficient mana, or a weapon with a powerful elemental enchantment. Simply being made of silver was not enough. Shaltir paid the female warrior behind her no heed, and looked at the shocked arcane magic caster. Magic arrow. In desperation, the magic caster cast a spell, sending 2 arrows of light streaking at Shaltir. However, they were easily resisted. This was the result of one of Shaltir's special abilities, spell resistance. It was not a perfect defense, and depended on the attacker's own strength. However, given the precipitous gap between their power levels, she could easily resist spells from him. In other words, there was nothing the arcane magic caster could do to Shaltir. Susaburuorthfying. With a casual wave of her hand, Shaltir relieved the person, who no longer interested her, of his head. Looking back, she saw that the lesser vampire was still struggling with the other warrior. Shaltir picked up the 2 fallen heads on the ground and tossed them at the 2 combatants. The heads, massing about 6 kilograms each, flew forth with supernatural speed. Then, as expected, both sides collapsed to the ground. While Shaltir was not paying attention, the desert, the female warrior, flailed wildly at Shaltir's body with her sword. Still, what good did that do? It did not hurt or even bother Shaltir, and it was a meaningless gesture. The only effect it had was opening up holes in her clothes, but as long as Shaltir herself was fine, the magic clothing would automatically restore itself. Now Thireen Desiriert. Let's eat it. Shaltir sounded like a child leaving their favorite food for the last. However, she had a nauseating, wicked smile on her face as she turned to face the female warrior who was hacking away at her back. As the female warrior met Shaltir's crimson gaze, the female warrior realized that she was the sole survivor, and stumbled back, eyes glistening with tears. She scrabbled at her waist pouch, fishing around inside for something. Shaltir leisurely savored the blood-dimmed world before her. She seemed curious about what the woman was doing. Soon, the female warrior pulled out a bottle and threw it. Shaltir narrowed her eyes at the bottle tumbling through the air, and smiled coldly. Although the female warrior had hurled it with all her strength, the speed at which the bottle traveled seemed almost unbearably slow to Shaltir. She could have easily dodged it, but her pride as one of the strong did not allow her to avoid it. In addition, she wanted to see the look on the woman's face when her final trump card crumbled before her eyes. The urge to slaughter grew and grew. However, Shaltir tamped it down. After all, the more she controlled herself, the sweeter her delight would be when she finally indulged herself. Shaltir watched the bottle flying at herself, and idly contemplated it. It was probably holy water, or some sort of firebomb. She refused to give up despite knowing her struggles did not matter, and continued her pitiful resistance. Perhaps she should start by making her suffer, until she prayed for death, before slowly tasting her blood. If she was a virgin, she would drain her dry, but if not, there were all sorts of lovely games they could play together, as long as she minimized the amount of blood lost. Having made her decision, Shaltir swatted aside the flying bottle. The force of swiping at the bottle caused the crimson fluid within it to spill from the bottle's mouth and splash on Shaltir's skin. And then, there was a faint stinging pain. The insides of Shaltir's mind went white for a moment, and her bloodlust was instantly extinguished. She looked at the place from which the pain had come, which was the hand which had batted the bottle aside. An acrid odor and a wisp of smoke boiled up from the place where the liquid had touched her. Shaltir turned to look at the fallen bottle. Its mouth was open, and a faint, sweet scent came from it. Shaltir was very familiar with that container. It was a potion bottle of the kind commonly used in the Great Tomb of Nazareth. The liquid within should have been a low-tier healing potion. Since healing items could damage the undead, it was probably why Shaltir's skin had been slightly dissolved.